we're really happy to do our second show and tell, which is about the Free Hetherington collection. And we have Alvaro, who's was involved. He's going to kind of introduce the talk, and then we're going to kind of make it possibly a wider discussion about occupations or occupying different occupations in Glasgow, which Keith Miller and other people around will probably get involved in. What I've done is I've brought a selection of material from the Free Hetherington collection. So it gives you the history, a bit of history about how it began and what happened. But Alvaro can talk about that a bit more. I'll just introduce Alvaro.
Thank you. So yeah, as I say, the memories I have of the occupation are quite partial, and other people will probably have way more insight on how it came to happen, the workings of how things were organized and things like that. From my point of view, the first thing I remember about the Hetherington occupation is that I used to go to the research club. It was supposed to be a club for postgraduate students and senior students. And there were not many places in the university where you could socialize without actually spending money. In some cases, lots of money, because it's the West End, very, very expensive area. So international students like me with not a big budget to spend, and local people who were not wealthy were not really happy to have a meeting with their supervisor and have to spend a fortune in coffee or whatever every week just to have a meeting with their supervisor, things like that. So that's what the Hetherington Research Club was. That was the role of the Hetherington Research Club. So that was it was not the best kind of social space you could think of, and it was at times badly managed because, well, many reasons, not necessarily, anybody's fault. But it was quite appreciated as space. And then the university decided that should not go on, and they would close it down, and they did close it down. I think it was a couple of weeks after they closed it down, we were all grieving about the research club because we didn't have any place like that to hang out. And I got a text from Maria, and she said, like, oh, some students have occupied the Hetherington Research Club. Like, those were the times when the Occupy movement and all that stuff, and I just recently have heard that you could actually come into a building and occupy it more or less by force, without any kind of legal previous work. Just go in and take it. So that was something you saw in the news, and it was quite exciting. But then I got the text that the Hetherington Research Club has been occupied and reclaimed to be managed by the students. So come here as soon as possible. And then a few of us got this text. Whoever could would rush in there, and it was all a bit of chaos. There were lots of security guards who didn't know what to do because there were like students flooding into a building that should be boarded, and no one knew exactly what to do, even though there was a core group who had planned the occupation and had I get the impression, I never talked to them about it actually. I became friends with many of them, but I never asked them what the plans were beforehand. They have very precise plans on how to organize everything, but I think those plans couldn't be followed very, very closely because everything turned very chaotic very quickly. And new people who got in started kind of getting that you could sort of make things up as you go. And then we started finding ways of discussing things and organizing. I think one of the first things that got organized was the kitchen. And there's that sign of of Don't Be Shy. Was that this one? This is one of the first things I remember about the Hetherington, because that was, there may have been other things that were organized first, but this was the first instance where I saw this kind of model of self-organization that was starting to be tried at the Hetherington. So yeah, people kept coming. We were briefed that people would have to be there at all times, otherwise the university would claim it back. So arrangements were started to be made about sleeping there. I think I started spending nights there, I think after a week or so I started attending. And very quickly general meetings were started being called. At first, the crowd involved in the occupation was changing quite a lot, like people would come in and out, but then it became more stable. After a few weeks, probably, it was more or less a core group that were always there, and this core group tended to possibly grow a bit. And that was the first time many of us had the experience of attending a meeting where everybody has the same ability to speak, to propose, and to decide. Like, that was a new thing for most of us. Some people there seem to be kind of more experienced than that, but I would say for probably 95% that was the first experience we had of autonomous organization and non-hierarchical organization. And the first thing we started doing were practical things, but they were also since the very beginning, everything was pointed at resisting the cuts. And that was another thing that triggered the occupation, was that there was an imminent avalanche of cuts, and they were going to close complete faculties of the university, and they were going to strip the university to a bare minimum and cut things that were being completely economically viable and were like very appreciated not only by society but by the government itself, like the Slavonic Studies department, I understand, was working. Lots of people in the what's that called, the foreign office and stuff had studied in the Slavonics department, and that was quite important to kind of educate people on international relationships and stuff. And but the government wasn't doing much, wasn't caring that much about keeping that. Also, nursing, the senior management wanted to altogether close nursing when it was one of the best performing parts of the university. And so with other parts of the university, we had a new principal, Anton Muscatelli, who had done that in other universities. Like, he was parachuted into universities. He will cut everything to the bare minimum, hand the cut bits to private business to make a profit, and then move on to a new university, do the same. He's still at Glasgow Uni as the principal. I think that's a record for him. I don't know why he wasn't moved to another university, probably because he didn't succeed. But that was kind of a unifying theme for everything that happened at the Hetherington, was like resisting the cuts and not let senior management get their way. That was, as I say, unifying, but for some people it was a bit of a kind of an excuse for a deeper kind of fight. And for others, it was just, the only thing that went wrong with the university was that senior management had these kind of crazy ideas of cutting everything down, but everything was basically fine. Others thought, like, no, we don't like the concept of university as it is, as a hierarchical institution and stuff. So we are up for improving it, but in the end, we believe it should be completely dismantled. So there were like all this spectrum between the people who wanted to change just the bits of capitalism that don't work and the people who wanted to dismantle everything and start from scratch. And you could see, I became aware of that very gradually, who was the position of every person that was involved in that spectrum. But it was quite interesting to see, and it was incredibly diverse. And they, like even the most kind of liberal, let's change just bits kind of characters were learning the same kind of techniques of autonomous organization, and were interested also in, for example, one of the first things we started talking about was safer spaces policies. And that was the first time many of us heard those words at all. And the stuff we used to discuss at the Hetherington occupation, I still see snippets of that in the safer spaces policy of many institutions that keep appearing right now. The Glasgow Autonomous Space, even the Glasgow Women's Library, like places that don't have any kind of direct connection to the Hetherington. They have taken on the legacy of lots of discussions we used to have at the occupation about safer spaces, how to enforce them, also many of us were educated in performative action, and kind of the means we were using for anything were constantly discussed as if they were reflecting the ends. Like, for example, how were we going to react about the rugby team, Glasgow University Union rugby team, who came often and tried to beat people up, and they were quite violent towards us and tried to sabotage everything we did. There were like this group of posh, very right-wing students that were like, it really bothered them, the very existence of the Free Hetherington. So how we were kind of reacting to that was like constant, like, what do we want to do about that? Whatever we do will have to reflect, what we wanted to achieve, which was we were not going to Glasgow University Union and try to beat anybody up, because that wouldn't reflect what we wanted to achieve, which is no violence. So that was an example. About food, there was also endless discussions on what was acceptable, what were not acceptable, what were our resources, how would we manage to function with the resources we had, what was the policy on alcohol, what were the policies on drugs, what were the policies on many things. And then it was a constant kind of school for all of us, because it was the first time we were discussing these things in that kind of horizontal way, and not being taught by someone else, this is right and this is wrong. So that's the way how I in general remember the Hetherington occupation. It's mostly general things, because my memory is not very good and I don't remember particular things. If you ask me dates, I will probably get them completely wrong. But it went on for very long. Probably the first couple of months, it was this kind of learning. Then probably after the second month, we started feeling more confident and try to organize things there. So I started trying to recruit lecturers from computer science to give talks there, to give courses, to try to do some sort of experiments on how education should be, rather than, you enroll in a lecture, you attend the lecture theater, you get marked, all these things. So we were trying to kind of engage academics into playing with what can we do in a space like the Hetherington in terms of occupation. So I did bring lecturers to give talks, try to do kind of academic-like things. I remember there were workshops where people would bring their homework and would work on mathematics and physics and things like that, and I would also get involved now and then on that. So that was like I would say a second stage where we started feeling confident, and the Hetherington started working as a distinct kind of project. That, in spite of the group that kept it running, was as diverse as always. We had the same differences we had since the very beginning that didn't change at all, but we learned to work together increasingly better. But then after that, hey, how's it going? In the last months of the occupation, I don't know what could have been the kind of inflection point or the point where things stopped working as well. I think probably tiredness started to kick in, because many aspects of keeping the Hetherington going were quite hard, like having people sleeping there all the time, constantly dealing with the sabotage from Glasgow University Union people, constantly worrying about safety, constantly worrying about the police trying to break in. Well, usually not the police, but kind of security, Glasgow University security people. All these kind of things were quite tiring, and people start like problems between people that were not necessarily always related to differences in ideology, but more like petty personal grievances started to creep into everything, and you could see that meetings were less about how do we go about doing this, but more about whose fault is that this happened. So that started to be more and more like that. And then people got disillusioned, and some people started disengaging from the things they were. And then it was decline in that sense, even though interesting things would still happen. And there's something interesting, and is that for the outside world, the time when something like the Hetherington occupation is starting being visible is when the thing is actually already in decline. That's when the outside world started noticing, and then we had like important people coming in, and that will sort of boost the confidence and boost the kind of energy of the place. So that kept it going a bit more. But in the end, I think it was pretty much unsustainable. And we were all surprised that at the very end, we were probably more enthusiastic than senior management at making the whole thing stop, because it was very hard on us. But they were still terrified, and they will be still like willing to commit to do things in exchange of us leaving, which was incredible. Like they were not very good negotiators, really, I think, because we just needed an excuse to leave.
So that's make them feel you're stronger than you actually are.
Yeah, I guess. And in the end, they did commit to some things. They didn't really do what they promised. But I think the main it's hard to try to assess what were the consequences of the occupation. But I think it was successful in many ways, and the way it was more successful was because it produced a generation of people who learned how to organize. That was probably the main success of the occupation, and connected us with things that were going on in Glasgow. Yeah. Yeah.
Well done for the talk.
Okay, thank you.
Not being completely familiar with the occupation, what was the full length of time?
The what?
How long was it?
I think it was like 6 months. Something. It was because it started on the 1st of February. I don't remember when was the agreement to evict.
That's 30th
You
of
remember?
August. That's when it
30th of August. Yeah, so a bit more than 6 months, I guess.
was the longest student occupation in the UK.
Mm.
To put that on the scale.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was longer for about 2 months than the second longest, or something like that. Because that's a very difficult thing to sustain. I think it went on for so long because there were so many people involved. I think that made it possible. I don't know. That's my theory.
I think that sign probably had a lot to do with it.
The what?
The sign, like the wash the dishes.
Yeah,
that idea
possibly.
that everybody wants revolution, nobody wants to do the dishes. It was good getting that in right at the beginning, which was a good solid
that's true.
foundation to start on. But I mean, I remember using the place, as friends of mine's, and it was a bit like a kind of wee elite club at one point. If the pubs were shut, you go up, and people could sign you in, so it was this wee cubby hole that you could go after the pub so long as you had the right, ticket to get in, stuff like that.
Oh, yeah.
You mean the Hetherington Club?
Aye.
Not the
It was quite
occupation.
nice.
So the university decided to close the Hetherington because, the only way it was funding it was by allowing it to be in the building. They weren't giving the Hetherington any money, were they? Or were they employing bar staff? Or
When it was a social club,
yeah,
it went bust. It was an independent business, a bit like the student unions. I think it received a grant each year from the university.
right.
It was poorly managed, effectively, and it ran out of money. I think the university refused to bail it out, which was obviously a political decision on their part. And the building lay empty once it shut down.
But what I was going to say is, like the building was actually getting used for a really good thing during the occupation. That was a really good idea for that space,
Yeah.
even than what it was before.
I think for students to be able to go somewhere like that and access education in that way, because it's just getting even tougher to be a student. I think there's more and more students. I was doing a master's and there was like 40 people and they didn't have any more staff, so the staff didn't have time to mark your stuff. You had no communication, really, no support, no communication. So to have that kind of idea that education is about learning something, not being tortured through this process, I don't.
Taking it back before the occupation, I remember going to Clydeside IWW and other groups did have their meetings in the Hetherington, so it was kind of established that it was a place that groups like that could book. I don't know at the time there was the Electron and other places were available. There wasn't certainly there was space, and I suppose Kinnan Park was on the go, but there wasn't so many places to use. So they had a wee reputation prior to that, which kind of made people sympathetic right from the word go, I think. But I was going to ask, at what stage did you get a lot of people who weren't students getting involved? Because I think I was aware of,
Yeah,
by the time I kind of turned along, how many students are actually involved in this?
I think it was always more students than non-students.
Oh yeah. But
Yeah, I don't know. Someone involved that right away.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just on my lunch break, so I can't stick around for long. I was involved with Hetherington from kind of before we occupied it until the end, and I think the kind of original group of people that had been involved in organising it, a lot of them ended up dropping out, and a kind of a new wave of people came in part because personal politics and people falling out, people getting tired of it, people going away over the summer, and then I think that the numbers really dwindled during the summer. Because students aren't about, the university campus was dead and it ended before the next term started, which I think the university were quite pleased about, but there was no purpose in keeping it running really. But in terms of the number of non-students, I think people heard about it, and people from around the world would come to it, like kind of people that gravitate to squats and social centres and things would hear about it and would travel to Glasgow and come and potentially stay. I mean, we didn't really want it to be a squat because we wanted it to be a political occupation to win things rather than just be a squat, which there's nothing wrong with having a squat, but that was never the intention from the outset. And I suppose it just kind of drifted into being that.
Yeah. Another question. I see the sign over there that says how to run something meeting, occupation meeting. I always find it interesting with these types of struggles or occupations. What method do you use? Like consensus, Robert's rules, hybrid consensus? And did you in the beginning of the day sort of have a report back sort of meeting in the morning of all the different groups? Because it says, and it looks like there's a lot of different organizations that don't necessarily get along on a regular basis. How did that, become cohesive? How did that work together?
Yeah, I think it was mostly consensus, wasn't it?
I mean,
That was the default.
I think there was probably quite a lot of internal disagreement because there's people from all kinds of political traditions. There was kind of anarchists, people that had been involved in kind of climate camps and things where all the kind of hand motion signals and all that consensus politics were a big thing. And I think that had come probably through the kind of anti-capitalist movement and the climate movement in the late 2000s and then fed into the student movement. But then there was also people from like a Trotskyist tradition of all sorts of Labour Party people, nationalists, all sorts. And so I think there was probably a lot of cynicism from some people about these methods, but I think in the end it was felt to be the best way of doing it. It was certainly very kind of in vogue at that point in time in activist politics to have those kind of rules in place.
In an average week, like you'd have to have a rota or something. You wouldn't. Not many people would be permanently sleeping there, would they? Or would you sleep there 2 times a week or something, or was it different from that?
I think we established a rota in the summer when the numbers went down, we were worried that they would go down under a critical level.
Before that,
there was no. I don't remember being any rota before because there was never lack of people. We were never missing people before.
And was there a picket outside, or was there people on the door all night, or?
No, I don't think so.
I think there was a bar on entry, maybe at 11 p.m. or something. So I think probably when it was at its peak, probably up until the eviction on the 22nd of March, and then maybe the month after that, probably until the term finished. And people went away after the exams. I think at that point there's probably always lots of people in the occupation, lots of people staying overnight, always people on the door apart from when it got locked up. But during the summer when there was maybe only 2 or 3 people in the occupation at any given time, it was almost kind of who wanted to be there, who could be there. And then there was people that would kind of always be there, and that was potentially problematic because it wasn't really meant to be a space that people lived in as such.
And were students still kind of attending their courses and?
Oh yeah. I think if anything, I think the Free Hetherington, in the cases I knew, it didn't come in the way of studying, but made it actually easier.
Yeah.
Because even though you were spending lots of time in meetings and stuff, it was quite a handy place to go hang out, do your homework, do your reading, which people, some of them didn't have before. And the way we were living, I talked to about, like I say my case, when I first arrived to study, the university halls were really not ideal place to live and study. I would try and spend much time as I could in my office because the university halls were really bad. And also the kind of social interaction around the Hetherington was something people, I don't know, help people massively to deal with stress, to sort of have a kind of, that may sound counterintuitive, but it helped lots of people to have a more organized life. I remember I met a couple of people who were a disaster when they started hanging out at the Hetherington, and I think they were attracted because it was so chaotic, and they liked that, and they were very, like, really a disaster. But then they learned to sort of take, they started getting involved in cleaning up the place. They started getting like a kind of structure in terms of hours of the day. They started to get more disciplined in many ways, in a way that was not imposed in a kind of forcefully way, but like kind of consensual, and let's do this is fun, let's make it work. And I think maybe I'm biased because the people who didn't need to structure learn to structure their time and stuff, they may not spend that long in there. But I think, if anything, it was helping people to study and perform better at study. Yeah.
And what if the violence that you were talking about from the rugby union, how did you deal with that then?
Well, there was mostly kind of trying to denounce it and get people to know and kind of be vocal about it. But we didn't, in the end, we never came out with any kind of immediate reaction strategy. I don't think we did. I don't know if I was.
Yeah, I think the kind of student bureaucracy and the kind of established power centres of kind of well-off students at the university, like the GUU, but also the SRC and the Queen Margaret Union. They didn't like the Hetherington because they didn't have any control over it. It was out with kind of student politics is quite cliquey, and people kind of rise through the ranks and can see themselves being student president in a couple of years' time if they just sit quiet on the student board or whatever. And the Hetherington came from nowhere and was this alternative power structure, and in many ways was much more attractive than the student unions as a place to go. And we wanted to work with student unions because obviously part of the reason why the Hetherington was so successful is literally the week after we occupied, the university announced masses of cuts to various departments, including the whole nursing department, which doesn't exist anymore at Glasgow, the adult learning department, which I think has been renamed, and a couple of other things. So that was the biggest boost the Hetherington could possibly have had, so lots of new people wanted to get involved in the campaign around that, and the student unions also couldn't avoid that they had to campaign around this. But because the Hetherington was full of lots of experienced activists who would have been campaigning on that anyway, it was able to kind of take the initiative and run a much better campaign than the established student bureaucrats would have been able to. But in terms of the kind of conflict with some people, I mean, they still have our banner somewhere in a cupboard at the GUU, the big Welcome to the Free Hetherington banner that was out the front. I don't know if they still get it out sometimes, but they came in the middle of the night and stole that. And there was a bit of conflict there, but we kind of tried to not rise to it.
Yeah, I think we tried to downplay all those things and not make it into a big deal in general. We could have, but there was no point.
So for those who have just come in, I was saying, or have come in since we started, there's material from the Free Hetherington collection around the room that you can have a look at any time. I don't know if people want to go on and talk.
I was wanting to raise the question of the Crichton situation. Was that around about the same time, Crichton campus and Dumfries? Because obviously when you're talking about cuts, there was a real threat to that, and there was a successful campaign to kind of keep that open, and that was quite visible around university, and the IWW was involved in that, obviously, because Ben Franks was a lecturer, etc. So I don't know, I can't remember exactly, it was the same time.
Earlier. I think that's before I came to
So that was just preceding it, so it was almost like a forerunner of that then.
But at Crichton may well have been hit by the cuts then.
Yeah.
Right. We certainly had some contact with a few students there.
I see as well there's a banner for the Bone Accord Centre.
Yeah, because that was happening at the exact same time. The funny thing is, the day of the Hetherington eviction, Tuesday 22nd of March, literally the next day was when Margaret Giaconelli got evicted from her house in Dalmarnock. And we were so buzzing from getting back in to the Hetherington that no one really noticed it happening that morning, because it was dawn raid. They were at her house, mob-handed with a helicopter. It was very similar to what had happened at the Hetherington the previous day. This is a woman who didn't want to give up her house for the Commonwealth Games. It was going to be levelled to be a car park, and at the same time an adult daycare centre for people with learning difficulties was also going to be demolished for a car park for the Commonwealth Games. And they had a big campaign about saving that, and I still don't think they've got a replacement centre. Yeah. And so we had really strong links with them. At one point we had this huge banner hanging out the window overlooking University Avenue saying kind of, where's the East End legacy with the Commonwealth Games, justice for the Accord Centre or something like that. So there was really good links with the two groups.
And the Games Monitor, was that really involved?
I think so, because the Games Monitor was kind of people in the geography department at Glasgow Uni, I think, Neil Gray and a few others. So yeah, they were very involved in Hetherington, yeah.
And how often you had to get almost like a free university set up in the second phase where you had sort of wee lectures come on and stuff, and I seem to remember going to quite a few meetings, and there was other things I could have gone to at the time.
I think that was, trying to remember, I think that was by the end of the term that most of these things happened, when the lectures have finished and before the exams or something like that, because both the lecturers and the students have more time in their hands, so they were willing to come and do things there.
There's a spin-off today, this year in the UCU strike where similar things happened, as part of the strike. They actually held lectures, and that happened down in Dumfries as well as here in Glasgow and stuff. So there was almost a legacy there.
Could I ask, I got the impression that this has been a very important part of your life, and it's affected your later life. So would you mind just saying, how, what's happened as a result of that in your own life, and maybe other people could, if they've been involved as well, could sort of add into that?
Yeah, well, I remember one day, that was, back in the day, it didn't look like something big, but looking from now, like from my perspective now, it was like very important for me. There was a time when one day Phil Jones and Michael Dunn came to present the Unity Centre. It was called only Unity. It was this kind of solidarity project that started as an asylum seekers union, and then it became the Unity Centre. That was like this place where asylum seekers would get kind of practical support, and then other projects were starting appearing around that. But then Michael Dunn and Phil Jones went to Hetherington. I think Phil Jones was quite reluctant to talk at the Hetherington, and in general, I think he didn't have a good opinion of the Hetherington for some reason. I never talked about that with him actually after. But then it was Michael who talked about unity, and I thought, oh, this all looks like a really good thing to be involved in, and that sort of started sort of. I didn't get involved immediately, but it came into my radar, and I started running into Unity things all the time. And when the Unity World Cafe and Food Bank started in Downhill Church, Lansdowne Church, then I immediately got involved in that because of the connections that were formed in the Hetherington occupation. And then after that, like, Unity's been, like, I've been doing lots of things with Unity since, and I'm still involved. So that was one thing. But the other thing is that, as I say, the experience of all these meetings and all these discussions and all making yourself kind of aware of how things are and how they could be, and being able to play with ways of organizing and all these things, that's something you don't unlearn, and it changed changed completely the way you see things. So yeah, I think that was the main thing for me, was like the connection with Unity. Yeah. I don't know what happened. What did the occupation got you into?
Criminal record, unfortunately.
Oh, congratulations.
I think a lot of connections were made through it. I think being in that kind of environment, which then brings a lot of people into activism, you then suddenly meet dozens of people. I think, yeah, the number of people I knew at the university was suddenly a much wider sphere of people, and all kinds of people getting involved, and a lot of people that weren't students as well that just came along. So I think that's one of the main things, yeah.
I personally must say, like, I've been around now for a few years and tried to get involved in activism here, and the Hetherington is everywhere. It's crazy. It's because I met the people before, and I didn't know they were in the Hetherington occupation. It was just something that came up as a field of interest to this year's UCU strikes and the occupation. But like finding that out, it's weird because there's loads of people I met through activism, and I met in like very central positions in like the groups they are, and like being very active there, doing loads of stuff. And it's, yeah, it was really surprising, like hearing it. Oh yeah, I've been in the Hetherington. I mean, it was just as surprising as it was not. It was just it was not surprising that these people have been in the Hetherington, but it's been surprising like how far it has spread, and like people still taking roles, still continuing the struggle. Or like I hear from people I meet just at random, and I think they're nice, and then they tell me, oh yeah, I've been there. They haven't been involved, but they've been there, and it's like it was like I've heard from people probably that are just I met barely in my life, and you probably just met barely, but it's like that is a connection point that is still there, and it's like it's crazy. It's really interesting, and I think this is like people that have influenced me now as an activist here have been people that have been influenced by the Hetherington, so definitely it continues and it just spreads on. And the occupation was so interested in the Hetherington event. I think just everyone is like in post-exam celebration and therefore forgot about the event. But it's we're here, so it's like.
Who was Hetherington? Who was Hetherington?
Pardon?
Who was the person?
I think
What's the
it's
His name,
some professor at Glasgow University from the 19th century. Or
Did
something
just
like
leave some money or something?
Yeah.
that must have been it, yeah.
They donated the house.
Yeah, but not that house. I think a house where the geography documentation. What's that called? Like the library of the Department of Geography, I think, and languages. That's called the Hetherington House, and I think that's the bit that was donated by this person, Hetherington.
He seems like a nice guy.
Like, so was there a kind of knowledge of other occupations that had taken place in Glasgow, or other similar things like, well, Keith was talking earlier, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Free University, that was in Glasgow. Maybe you could talk a wee bit about that if you wanted, Keith, or different occupations were people aware of, for instance, Govan Hill Baths during the occupation.
Yeah, I think there was a keenness to relate it to different struggles that happened in the past, both like at the university and the wider city and internationally. And I think, I can't remember if there was lots of other student occupations happening at that time, because the kind of big struggle around the increase in fees had been December 2010. So November, December, there was a wee occupation at Glasgow University in the Gilmore Hill Theatre for one night, I think. But at the same time, it's, probably 50 universities up and down the country were occupying. I don't know if many were occupying by the time it came to March and then through the summer, because there wasn't a kind of struggle happening in the same way. There was localised ones happening, like the one over cuts at Glasgow, but probably not on the same scale. But in terms of linking to other struggles in Glasgow, yeah, I think there was a keenness to do that, and I'm sure there was events and posters and things up about stuff like that.
Could you elaborate a bit further on the Free University?
Obviously a different time period, that was the late 80s and the early 90s. It didn't actually, wasn't centred in one building or anything, although there was plans at one stage to tap funding to have a building, but basically that never quite materialised. So we just had a series of meetings all around Glasgow with some initiatives that were much bigger, like the mock parliament, I can't remember what it's called, something, scratch parliament. And there was also, the biggest one was obviously the Chomsky event in Govan, but most of the thing was much, much smaller, and it was just it was moved around various places like the Western Motor Club near St George's Cross and various other places. It was initiated by by a collaboration of writers and artists and people involved in magazines, brought together by the editor of the Edinburgh Review, Peter Kravitz. It's his initiative, really. So it lasted for a good 3 or 4 years, and then I think I was involved a lot in the tail end just to keep it going. But eventually, like all things, after about 5 years. But that was quite a long period that persisted.
What is the tail end?
Sorry?
The tail end.
Tail end.
Tail end.
Yeah, towards the end of the initiative, really, it sort of petered out a bit, but it kept on going a lot longer. Part of the reason it maybe petered out towards the end, because a lot of people like James Kelvin that had been involved in a big way diverted their energies towards Workers' City and that kind of that initiative and things. So and the Glasgow Keeley, which was their publication, etc. So. But, these are things that come and go. It's one of these ideas that pops up everywhere now and again. The idea of learning as a sort of different activity than something handed down to you. So this is an example of it in a way. Every quarter, us doing this is a thing that's in that tradition.
Yeah, and there's stuff, I think it's in the James Kelman collection, which we've got the digital material from James Kelman. His archive is at the National Library of Scotland, but he gave material to Spirit of Revolt to digitise, which is available online. We haven't catalogued it all yet, but there's certainly stuff from the Free University programmes for that Scratch Parliament, different events, and
What's a Scratch
lots of stuff
Parliament?
about Workers' City and the Keeley and various collections. And if you're interested in that kind of radical history or of events and activities in Glasgow that's from the 80s really, isn't it?
Yeah, it was about 87 through to 93.
Yeah, and there was stuff in your the KM collection as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to briefly mention the as you mentioned, squats and the kind of problems with squats. But we took over Glasgow University property in way back in 1975, 76, and ran it. But it wasn't just a place to stay. We actually used it as a political centre, an anarchist squat essentially, in 17 Bute Gardens, right at the top of the hill on Great George Street. Unfortunately, we weren't very meticulous about taking photographs of it, and that's the only photograph I could find, other than a picture of two kittens, which is not very cute, but not very helpful. So we didn't keep proper records of what it was, but it was a very interesting building on something like 4 levels. So there was a hardcore political activists involved in that. The actual building had been used for a while by Mike Gonzalez, a kind of lecturer, and then he'd handed it over to some women's refuge who then moved out, and then we moved in, and then eventually we gave it back to another refuge or something. But it wasn't, when we were there, we kind of upped the ante by painting the door. It was supposed to be red and black, but we never got beyond the red bit. And we came under siege because the authorities were, was thrown down the gauntlet towards them. But eventually, we established a kind of a good working relationship with some of the people. Even took in mail for us and stuff. But they had there was a whole room just full of bottles, which belonged to the Department of Urology. It was like taking the piss, literally. So basically, we got all that moved out. So once we cooperated and things, we were actually keeping the building open in some sort of running condition. But there was another squat just literally along the road, which was very low key, just full of opportunists, basically. There was a guy who had a sports car, for example, parked outside, and he stayed there. So it was a completely different. They didn't want any trouble at all, and they were just pure opportunists. But it lasted for about a year. There was another squat further down the road that was is now a car park in Great George Street, 163 Great George Street, around the corner into Lilybank Gardens. But it's all just that car park that's kind of raised off. But we did hold some political meetings there, but we had a silk screen, for example, and all sorts of things in a room that was about half the size of this, so it shows how big the lounge was. So it was a massive place. So it's an important learning curve, living together with a group of people like that. And we did try and create a Glasgow Squatters Union, but we found out that the attitude towards squatters in a lot of areas wasn't so good, and a lot of the squatters were just principally opportunists. They didn't really want to politicise or even publicise their identity as squatters. So we found out that it was one big mire of when we went into places like Govan Hill and stuff. It wasn't squatters. So that was
How many
interesting
people were
period.
in the squat then?
Well, we didn't all crash together in one huge room or anything. It wasn't like that. We all had rooms. It was like that. So we had a proper living space and things. So there was only about 7 at any one stage. But it did include quite a few anarchists, including at one stage Jean Beer, who's quite a famous anarchist. She at one stage stayed in the basement with us, and she wasn't involved in kidnapping prime ministers and things in Italy and stuff. But anyway, so it was an interesting period. But there wasn't many other instances of squats in Glasgow were criminal offence, so it wasn't as easy as it was, and we got away with it really because the university just wasn't as heavy-handed as other places. But one day, for example, I was at a gig recently in Shawlands at Glad Cafe, and this guy came up to me at half time and said, "I know you from way back." And he explained he was 15-year-old, and a bunch of his mates, a wee bit older than him, they'd all moved into this big house in Curzon Street and took it over basically, and the landlord of course was turning up the next day heavy-handed to evict this bunch of kids basically, and well we did mobilise for it, but I think the key thing is we actually got the Herald, the Glasgow Herald, some journalist along, and that publicity made the guy completely capitulate, and he offered them a peppercorn rent for a ridiculous amount. And this guy had obviously remembered this all his life. He hadn't stayed there with his mates for too long because he was only just 15. I think he had to go back to his parents, but it was one of these things that's kept. And how he managed to remember me after, because I had no idea who he was. but you know, similarly, when these, so all these life experiences are important. You know? But anyway.
Right, well, I don't know if anybody wants to just have a look at some of the stuff now, or if anybody's got anything else they want to add.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Right, it was just curiosity. Did you find at all that you had sympathy for lecturers and then they were maybe like nobbled and couldn't come and show support, or are they quite vocal at coming out and showing support? Sorry, did you find that during the occupation you got support from lecturers, or were the lecturers, did they have to kind of keep quiet because the authorities might reprimand them?
Well, the lecturers I knew, I think probably 70% of them did support the occupation, but were not very vocal about
Not
it.
officially.
Not because of fear, but I think because of peer pressure. They thought that was like a youthful folly, kind of. You know, I'm too old for these things. I'm a respectable lecturer. I'm not into this kind of stuff. So most of them had a lot of sympathy for the occupation, but were like, they thought, oh, this is young people's thing. Is not really my problem. I sympathize with it. Yeah, a few of them were like actively supporting it.
Yeah, brilliant.
And a few of them were against, mostly because they were right wing. Sorry, I have to go back to work now.
Okay.
Thank you.